Imagine warriors marching into battle wearing necklaces of human ears, teeth being pulled out of fresh corpses as souvenirs, men boiling the flesh off the severed heads of their enemies so they can keep the skulls as trophies. You're probably imagining a clan of ancient barbarians fighting Rome, or an obscure tribe deep in the Amazon jungle. In fact, this was the behavior of the United States of America in the Second World War. Throughout the Pacific Campaign against the Japanese, American troops developed a reputation for gruesome trophy hunting. Countless bodies were desecrated by American soldiers, who took pieces of their fallen enemies home as war trophies. Every soldier knew it happened, and almost everyone back in America knew too. But the truth was quickly buried after the war ended. The fact that American troops dismembered corpses didn't fit into the neat narrative of heroic America, marching off to save the world from the evil Japanese Empire. Today, on A Day in History, we'll show you the gruesome truth about American trophy hunting in the Second World War. Why did they do it? How? Keep watching to find out. Taking trophies in war is nothing new. Archaeology has found evidence for it stretching back at least 15,000 years. Trophy hunting for animals is even older, and has probably been with humanity for as long as we've been capable of complex thought. Human societies continued the practice long after settling into complex civilizations in every corner of the world. For example, the ancient Egyptians would cut off the hands or phalluses of their enemies as trophies and help count casualties, while the Aztecs constructed entire walls from the skulls of their defeated enemies. Such practices were well known in America too, for centuries before the Second World War. The collecting of human scalps, for example, was a common part of Native American warfare that white Americans also adopted, with bounties being paid out for Native American scalps well into the late 19th century. War trophies act as symbols of the victorious warrior's skill and serve as a final humiliation to the defeated enemy. This psychological appeal is powerful and has been felt by people across cultures and across time. But by 1941, the United States had surely moved past such behavior. Modernity had radically changed human morality, and things like slavery or trophy hunting were not unthinkable evils that society would never allow, even if past societies had accepted them without question. Human war trophies were not a widespread issue in the First World War, for example, so why would it be any different in the Second? Well, there were a few reasons why the Americans were so brutal to the Japanese. The first is obvious. The Japanese were also horrible to their enemies. The Imperial Japanese Army was legendary for its cruelty towards civilians and prisoners alike, be they American, Chinese, or anyone else. The list of Japanese war crimes is excruciatingly long. Wholesale massacres like at Nanking, the mass sexual abuse of comfort women, the monstrous experiments of Unit 731, or the horrific list of torture techniques including bamboo torture and waterboarding. You can check out our other videos of Japanese war crimes for more, but it's undeniable that Imperial Japan was capable of terrible things. These tactics weren't just brutal, but were seen by the Americans as underhanded and treacherous. The Americans expected a certain level of morality in the war, such as fair treatment of prisoners and respect for surrender, something that the Germans and Italians broadly followed in the European theater, at least for the Western Allies. But the Japanese blatantly ignored these unwritten rules. They tortured and killed anyone who surrendered, and would often abuse these expectations for their own gain. Japanese troops were known to pretend to surrender only to ambush the Americans when they got close, or play dead before springing up to attack the Americans. Nor did the Japanese care for battlefield rules of respecting the dead, hiding explosives on the corpses of fallen Americans, or displaying their mutilated remains to frighten their comrades was a common practice. Then there was the fact that Japan began the war with an undeclared surprise attack on Pearl Harbor that killed thousands of sailors, soldiers, and civilians without warning. Many American soldiers decided that if Japan wasn't going to play by any rules, they shouldn't either. Desecrating bodies was outlawed by the 1929 Geneva Convention. After every engagement, the belligerent who remains in possession of the field shall take measures to search for wounded and the dead, and to protect them from robbery and ill treatment. Unfortunately, the Geneva Convention was often one of the first casualties in any wartime encounter. We also can't avoid talking about racism. The mostly white American forces saw the Japanese as racially inferior and not entitled to the same respect as the Germans or Italians America were fighting in Europe. Japanese Americans were forced into concentration camps during the war, and wartime propaganda was full of racist caricatures and stereotypes about them. American propaganda referred to the Japanese as rats, monkeys, insects, and other dehumanizing terms, with British reports on the American war attitude concluding that Americans saw the Japanese as a nameless mass of vermin. Racist stereotypes of misshapen men with yellow skin and buck teeth became ingrained in the minds of US soldiers. As one Marine veteran said, "We had been fed tales of these yellow thugs, subhumans with teeth that resembled fangs. If 100,000 Japs were killed, so much the better." This idea of the Japanese as animals was a dominant theme in US propaganda. In some ways, US soldiers were taught to see the Pacific Theater not as a war against equals, but a hunt against beasts. Around 25% of American men hunted for sports at the time, and it was an activity that could be found among rich and poor men, and in almost every corner of the country, so the analogy had mass appeal. The US Marines even put out recruitment ads offering a Japanese hunting license and declaring open season on the enemy with free ammo and equipment by joining the Marines. Hunters rarely take prisoners, and the same was true of US soldiers fighting the Japanese. The Japanese rarely surrendered, and the Americans rarely accepted it when they did. According to one source, there were only ever 5,424 Japanese POWs held by the Allies throughout the entire war, and most of those were taken in 1945. It was also in a hunter's nature to take trophies. Instead of antlers or pelts, American soldiers would have to make do with other gruesome souvenirs. Ears were probably the most common type of trophy. Easy to remove and easy to keep, it was so common that almost every unit had at least one man with a collection of ears he built up over his deployment. They were usually pickled in brine to prevent them rotting. Some would arrange them onto necklaces and wear them into battle. Ear necklaces weren't technically allowed, but no one cared about enforcing those rules for men on the front lines. Ear trophies were accepted as inevitable by most soldiers. As one account in a Marine magazine from mid-1943 said, "The other night, Stanley emptied his pockets of souvenirs, 11 ears from dead Japs. It was not disgusting, as it would be from the civilian point of view. None of us could get emotional over it." The American public also learned about this grisly habit. A January 1943 issue of Yank, a popular magazine aimed at soldiers, poked fun at the practice in a cartoon showing two happy parents receiving a necklace of severed ears from their son fighting in Asia. Teeth were another easy trophy. They were even easier to extract and keep hidden than ears, so long as you didn't mind prying them out of a corpse's gums. Of course, taking the teeth while the victim was still alive could double as a torture method too. One Marine veteran who served during the invasion of Peleliu in summer 1944 vividly recalled a fellow Marine cutting open the cheeks of a still living Japanese soldier and holding the man's mouth open as he pulled out his golden tooth fillings. Trophy hunting became a game for the soldiers. One officer recorded that his men kept a communal sack of teeth with gold fillings during the Marshall Islands campaign. The men in the unit would add to it over the course of the campaign, turning it into a grim record of their kills. Bones were less convenient, but when the opportunity presented itself, the Americans could treat themselves to pieces of the skeleton. One sailor recalled how his crewmates took various pieces from the bodies of Japanese pilots after a wave of kamikaze attacks in November 1944. One of the Marines cut the ring off the finger of one of the dead pilots. One of the fellows had a Jap scalp. It looked just like you skinned an animal. One of the men on our gun mount got a Jap rib and cleaned it up. He said his sister wants part of a Jap body. One fellow from Texas had a knee bone and he was going to preserve it in alcohol from the sickbay. Gifting human trophies during the war wasn't even limited to soldiers. In June 1944, Pennsylvania Congressman Francis Walter sent President Roosevelt a letter opener fashioned from the bone of a dead Japanese soldier, sent to him by a constituent. Roosevelt declined the gift and asked Walter to give the bone a proper burial instead. The most difficult and controversial trophies were skulls. These grisly prizes were usually taken from long-dead Japanese soldiers, whose bodies had already begun to decompose, but reports of freshly severed heads are also known. Skulls weren't as convenient as teeth or ears. They had to be skinned and cleaned, a process which even frontline soldiers would find too gruesome. Still, soldiers had their ways of doing it. In 1944, one officer remembered a soldier who had taken a severed head from a fallen enemy. He was trying to get the ants to clean the flesh off the skull, the officer wrote in his journal. But the odor got so bad we had to take it away from him. This soldier's method was unusual. The usual process was to boil the skull so the flesh simply melted off. Remaining strips of flesh would be scrubbed away later. Sailors would tie a line through some of the skulls and drag them behind the boat for a while, letting the salt water and fish clean away the mess until a clean skull was all that remained. These skulls made for impressive and frightening souvenirs, but they weren't as convenient to carry as necklaces of ears or teeth. Instead, skull trophies might be pitched on a stick outside camp, or used as a grim hood ornament for a jeep or tank. Some skulls were kept as personal souvenirs and went home with their soldiers, or were sent home as gifts to the family. Gifts of human remains were common enough that soldiers were quite casual about it. "Do you want a Jap skull?" one soldier stationed in India wrote back to his family in 1944. "Now that I'm better acquainted with mailing ways, I'll try to ship home something better than I already have." During the Guadalcanal campaign, a minor scandal occurred in military circles, when photographs claiming to document the process of cooking and scraping the heads of dead Japanese soldiers were circulated among soldiers. The grisly photos made it all the way up the chain of command. The Joint Chiefs of Staff radioed General Douglas MacArthur, commander of the entire Pacific Theater, asking him to crack down on trophy hunting, but nothing came of it. A directive issued in January 1944 ordering US commanders to crack down on human trophies did nothing to stop the practice. Skulls and other remains continued to be taken, and troops stationed at Guadalcanal afterwards were known to sell Japanese skulls to curious merchant seamen who stopped by. An even larger controversy erupted in May 1944, when Life magazine published a photo of an American woman smiling at the skull of a Japanese soldier sent to her by her boyfriend overseas. "This is a good Jap. A dead one picked up on the New Guinea beach," the commentary read. It was one thing for soldiers to talk about the desecration of bodies, but for it to appear in the pages of a major civilian magazine was quite another. The photo triggered a wave of angry letters from the public, who called it cruel and insensitive. Surely, if such a photo had been published of a Japanese girl smiling at an American skull, the Americans would have been outraged and held it up as proof of Japanese depravity. Several religious organizations also condemned it as un-Christian. In response to the Life article controversy, the army denounced trophy taking as repugnant to the sensibilities of all civilized peoples, and ordered commanders to do everything in their power to stamp out the practice. Military authorities warned that soldiers caught desecrating the dead might be charged with a crime. The more practical concern that public displays of these mutilated remains might encourage retaliation from the Japanese was probably a more persuasive argument to the average soldier. Indeed, the Japanese media and public leapt on the controversy. In August 1944, a government spokesman harshly condemned the mutilation of Japanese bodies. They compared it to the actions of African headhunters and said it proved that America was not the defender of human decency, honor, and righteousness that it claimed to be. When copies of the Life magazine skull photo reached Japan, every major newspaper covered it with righteous indignation. There was obviously a lot of hypocrisy here. The Japanese were more offended at the treatment of their dead than they ever were about their own treatment of millions of living people across East Asia and the Pacific. The controversy passed in a few weeks, however. The Japanese media moved on, and the investigation that US authorities opened into the Life article's skull decided that the officer responsible be sent a harshly worded letter, but nothing more. The largest war in history was still raging, and there were bigger problems to solve than the mistreatment of a few enemy corpses. Trophy hunting continued uninterrupted for the rest of the war. During the bloody Iwo Jima campaign in early 1945, so many Japanese skulls were taken as trophies that a Buddhist priest from the island issued a formal request in 1985, appealing to veterans to return them to the island where, in the name of humanity and the honor of warriors, they belong and can rest in peace. Skulls were still being taken by the hundreds during the final battle at Okinawa. After the war, this darker aspect of the conflict was quickly buried. Had the US lost the war, American trophy hunting and the mass mutilation of dead soldiers would probably be as infamous as the crimes of the Japanese are today. But history is written by the victor, and there was no way that the United States would have welcomed home its victorious soldiers with investigations or charges for mistreating their enemies. How could one even think to punish a soldier for slicing the ear off a dead enemy, when the US government had signed off on the annihilation of entire cities full of innocents? The truth about American trophy hunting was forgotten by most people over the years. Aside from the veterans and their families, who might ask about the strange skull on the family mantelpiece, most people forgot it ever happened. Awareness resurfaced briefly in Vietnam, where American troops engaged in similar trophy hunting, but soon faded again after that war. It was as the World War II veterans began to die off that attention returned to the trophies. Some of the veterans came to regret their treatment of the bodies in their final years and voluntarily returned to Japan. Other trophies were returned by family members after the veteran's death. A few have turned up in odd places. For example, a drought in Illinois in January 2000 led to the discovery of an unidentified skull at the bottom of Lake Springfield. Police were called, and after forensic investigation, it was found to have belonged to a Japanese soldier. It had been taken by a Marine during the Battle of Okinawa. He'd passed it down to his grandson, who decorated it for his bedroom before deciding it was too creepy. Not knowing what else to do with a human skull, he tossed it into the lake, but came forward after it was rediscovered. The skull was returned to Okinawa in 2003. A bit more attention in recent decades, and have made interesting discoveries. Perhaps the most obvious is the racial element of these trophy skulls. Out of all the known trophy skulls from the Second World War in the United States, every single one has been of Japanese soldiers, and never German or Italian. Most US soldiers never took human body parts as trophies. Bullets, patches, helmets, and other trinkets were by far the more common trophies of war. However, many thousands of Japanese soldiers had their remains taken by their victorious enemy, and many of them are still lost, sitting in a veteran's attic or hidden among family heirlooms long after the person who took it has passed away. We can only hope that some of these lost remains are finally given the respect that all dead people deserve, and provide some closure to this dark, forgotten chapter in the history of the Second World War.